Hey, I'm Tom, and recently I had the opportunity to work with my good friend Aaron on creating a new villain character for Havoc Protocol, a sci-fi miniatures line I started over 10 years ago. Aaron actually created the concept illustrations for the founders in the original Havoc Protocol Kickstarter, and it was a real treat to get to work with him again to visualize this villain. Havoc Protocol Villainy is live on Kickstarter right now. Havoc Protocol is a line of dynamic sci-fi miniatures set in a world that's Cowboy Bebop meets Ghost in the Shell and work great for cyberpunk or other sci-fi skirmish miniatures games. You can back these new figures now or get the entire line on an exclusive bundle. Just click the link in the description below. I've been a huge fan of Aaron's work ever since we first met in high school. We both share a deep love for comics, and I have always looked up to him as an artist. Frankly, he's the kind of artist I've always wanted to be. I mean, just look at his studio here. It is so stinking cool. It's surrounded with this amazing collection of books, toys, comics, and other things that just inspire him as he works on all the various creative projects. One of the things I love most about working with Aaron is his ability to bring a different design sense than I can do with designing on my own. Alright, well, let's get into talking about visualizing this villain. Aaron's gorgeously gritty inking style just adds so much to the depth of the design and the look of the world. This illustration you see Aaron working on here is actually one of two that he created when designing this character. But let's jump back. Let's talk about how this started. So I approached Aaron about making this villain character, but I wanted him to bring as much as he could, and he wanted his design sense and style, so I tried to keep things very loose. I had a couple key things. We started out by calling this character the cyber villain. I just wanted him to have some sort of bionic arm, sort of deadly thing, and then I threw a couple descriptive adjectives or inspirationals to Aaron so he'd have something to work from. Aaron's first round of sketches were definitely headed in the right direction, so with just a little bit of feedback, he started into refining some of the designs and moving on to coming up with some poses that would work possibly for the miniature, but definitely for the hero image used on the Kickstarter. Aaron was able to take all of this work and came up with two really good hero images, and he got started on both of them. He actually took them both very far and asked me to choose which one I preferred. And I ended up going with the second one. I just thought it would work a little better for the graphics and design layout needed for the splash page on the Kickstarter. But I'm really glad that he decided to move forward with inking this one as well. I'll wrap up this section of the video showing off the final inked illustration of the Havoc Protocol Villainy cybervillain, or as we've come to call him, Phantom Vulture. Aaron is a huge Metal Gear Solid fan, and I thought this character could fit very well in that sort of world as well, and so we wanted to come up with a fun MGS-inspired code name that could work in the Havoc Protocol world as well. These new Havoc Protocol minis are the first sci-fi figures I've done in 7 or 8 years. I think since I did Mercs and obviously the little cyborg dwarf guy that I did for my son a few years ago as well. So I wanted to try my hand at doing it all digitally. I've done tons of sci-fi traditionally, and it's challenging. So I was looking forward to being able to do certain parts, especially on this character, things like his cyborg arm, doing them digitally where I could have a little bit more control and implement some finer lines and really get sharp, crisp details. This was actually the last miniature in the new set that I sculpted, so I took one of the human body blanks that I made for the Havoc Troopers and brought it over to use for this guy. Changed some of the proportions just a little bit, the height, but the biggest thing I worked on here was the face. I didn't want the head to look exactly the same. Frankly, that's one of the things that's a little bit of a trap when it comes to digital sculpting, is you can reuse so many parts so easily that in a lot of cases it's very tempting to just grab the same head and use it over and over and over again. Sometimes you can get away with it, but with this being a really specific, unique character, I knew that I had to go in and make some additional modifications. One of the elements I was really worried about sculpting on this miniature was the sunglasses. I've done a few characters in the past with glasses, and it's always a tricky thing when it comes to doing it on a miniature. It's very easy to have them look excessively large or like big goggles or bulbous, and so having the ability to really massage and change the shape at will was a real bonus to working digitally. Once I completed the face, I knew I needed to start focusing on the next major element, and that was his coat. This was going to be the part, aside from the cybernetic arm, this is what was really going to define the character. It was going to create a lot of the silhouette and the shape and give a chance to create some really dynamic looks and effects. There's going to be a high collar, these large lapels, and eventually you'll see that I started to put in the tails of the coat as well. Whenever I sculpt these cloth or clothing details, I see a lot of sculptors, especially digitally, they tend to want to sculpt them like real clothes. They keep everything very thin and very fine, and that can be okay if you're doing this for things like video games, but when you're doing miniatures, even if you're planning on printing them, it can save you a lot of time and just help the whole thing look better and pop and be more durable if you work in large chunks. So even when you're working digitally, it's very important to think of this stuff as these large blobs of clay or putty that you're sticking on the figure. That will reduce the chance of having air pockets, undercuts if you're going to cast or mold and cast the things, and it just helps reinforce and support the whole structure as a whole. You can always go back later and trim things out, thin it down, but it's sometimes more of a pain to bulk it up after spending a lot of time keeping things super fine and super thin. I'm going to skip ahead to start showing you more about how I made the bionic claw arm element for this character. This is going to be kind of the main focal point of this piece here, and I knew that I needed to make something that stood out. Obviously I was working from Aaron's concept, but I was trying to balance it with how it would actually be represented in miniature. I wanted this arm to be a little bit larger, have a little more to it, but you have to be careful when you're translating a concept like this down into the miniature form, because especially if you're trying to overemphasize, it can very quickly get out of scale and out of proportion and just look strange. Now you'll notice when I'm working on the arm here, I was trying to work in that more organic style like I did for the Farmer Gamut miniature. So rather than setting up the sculpt, the arm, in a centralized area of the canvas and trying to use symmetry, I just went at it and started sculpting. I was trying to get some rough shapes in there, hard edges, and I do really like how this started out with some of the not so symmetrical shapes going on. However, as you'll see in a little bit, I soon realized that if I was going to get some of that crisper, nicer detail and be able to adhere more to what Aaron drew, I was going to have to start over and start with focusing on the arm rather than sculpting the arm on the figure itself. I was going to need to sculpt the arm as its own separate piece and then bring it in line to where it needed to be on the figure. It did slow me down a bit working this way, but I was much happier with how the arm as a whole turned out. I was able to employ a lot more interesting tricks and techniques that helped make the arm much more robotic looking, really emphasized that crisp, sharp detail and more of a machined look. Whereas when I was trying to do everything on the figure itself, maintaining that solid grounding and manually creating the symmetry was very challenging. It is still really weird to think of, though, how much more difficult it is to sculpt off the cuff digitally. And maybe it's not, maybe it's just a mental block I have, but when it comes to stuff, especially technical things like this, I had to do it manually when I was sculpting it traditionally all the time, you know, just do my best to line it up because there was no other choice. When it comes to this, when I would try and do it on the figure in real time, it was just so much more challenging than taking the piece and setting it as its own shape that I'm slowly building and forming as needed. Getting to use special tools like symmetry and some of these other Boolean effects where you can merge shapes into other shapes to create negatives and add positive shapes. It's an interesting change in the workflow. You can see here as I'm sculpting with the transparency on that some of those shapes I haven't merged yet. That circle and that little block shape down by the wrist, those, when I get farther along and I made a commitment to what I wanted those elements to be, I fused it together to create a finished shape. And I used some of those similar techniques here to create the robotic biceps and triceps. I started with my original main blocked out shape for a fleshy arm, and I created these boxes that could just knock out the shape to separate the bicep from the tricep and let them be independent parts with some really hard defined edges to make them look more like independently machined elements. You can see now as I got farther along, I made sure to position a torso next to the body. I knew I wanted to make this arm a little larger than the other, but I knew it's very important, especially digitally, to make sure you have reference points when you're sculpting. It's very easy to trick yourself and get out of the mindset of the scale of something and where the piece will rest in relation to the other elements. Another thing that was interesting in working this way was being able to really get into the element you're sculpting. What I mean by that is when you're sculpting, you have to work with the surface. You'll build up forms, and then you're creating the illusion of whatever you're sculpting. Well, you can see here as I was working on this, the joint area, I actually could make these pistons or hydraulic rods, and I had to make them completely as they were, not just fake it. I guess I could have put a blob on there, tried to sketch it in, but again, I wanted it to look very hard and machined and angular, and so I didn't want to take it that route. Plus, I knew that I was ultimately going to pose this figure, so it would have been silly to take the time to sculpt that specific detail just to have it bend. And in the end, it was actually pretty easy to manipulate when I ended up posing the arm, to just make a few adjustments and have the rod stretch out just a little more and make it kind of the whole idea of it come to life. Speaking of all these techniques, if you haven't already, go ahead and click the link in the description below and you can pick up my ultimate quick start guide to sculpting miniatures. Now, this focuses on traditional sculpting work, but there's still a lot of principles that you can apply whether you're doing traditional or digitally. In the end, it doesn't matter what tools you're using, we're still sculpting miniatures, and that's what really matters. Now, we've entered the home stretch with visualizing this villain, and the last part is really to go ahead and pose the figure. You'll actually notice here that I left the figure very rough. There's some of the major elements, obviously the arm. I did a fair amount of detailing on his boots and hair, a little more to his face. You can also see a little bit of cybernetic plating on his torso, just to give myself reference and something to work with as I adjust the figure. But there was one last thing left for visualizing, and that was to figure out the pose. The illustration Aaron did was great, and I would have made an awesome miniature, but I really like to The posing is really one of the most important things to me. I think it can make or break the miniature, and it's frankly the most fun I have when I'm sculpting. So once again, I broke out pencil and paper and got to work. Started doing a bunch of sketches and really tried to think about what would make this character stand out. What would make him look cool, interesting, but more importantly, how could I make him work better with the rest of the figures? I realized that a lot of the Havoc Protocol miniatures were carrying weapons. They're right-handed, most of them, so they're facing to the left, shooting downrange, if you will. And so I wanted to create an opposition to that. So I decided to turn the figure and have him looking to the right. This also was a great way for me to showcase the key element of this villain, the cybernetic arm. So after doing a bunch of sketches, I settled on this pose right here. I thought it really captured the attitude, the kind of cavalierness and brandishing of the claw that would give him just the right attitude and gravitas needed for some upstart enforcer to a crime organization. There are always 3 final stages for me sculpting a figure digitally. There's the main rough pose where there's no expression or anything, just the main body is in place. Then I go on to what I call detail posing, adding gesture to the hands, expression to the face, a little extra detail. And finally, I end on pumping in all the details to really kick the figure up and get it ready to put out. And that's how I went about visualizing this villain and making a real-life miniature out of it. What are some of the ways you go about visualizing your own miniatures? I'd love to hear about it. Or if you do it at all, maybe you just start sculpting and create these awesome pieces without hardly any effort at all. But whether you put much time or effort into visualizing your miniatures, there's one thing to remember: keep sculpting.